The Anunnaki did not die in the records. They did not lose battles or slowly fade away over hundreds of years. They simply stopped showing up as active rulers. And the scribes who noticed this kept writing anyway. Temples stayed. Rituals continued. Kingship may have continued. But somewhere between the early Sumerian texts and the later Babylonian chronicles, divine help became divine memory. And no tablet ever explains why. So before we begin, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe. But only if you are drawn to histories that ask uncomfortable questions about silence, about power that pulls back for no reason, about administrative records that suddenly change from recording presence to recording absence. And if you are still here, tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there. Well, I want to imagine this question stretching across continents and time zones, connecting us all through the same mystery that troubled Mesopotamian scribes 3,000 years ago. Tonight, we are reading ancient tablets, not for what they say, but for what they stop saying. We are tracing a pattern across thousands of years where divine names shift from legal guarantors to ritual memories, where kingship changes from a command lowered from heaven to an office passed down through bloodlines, where the most careful record keepers in human history simply moved on from one era to another without recording why. This is not about gods in myth. It is about gods in accounting ledgers. In the beginning, there were names, not prayers, not cosmic stories, not lone creation myths, just names pressed into wet clay next to lists of barley and livestock. Around 3300 BC in the city of Uruk, scribes learning the world's first writing system included divine names in the earliest exercises Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag. These were not vague religious ideas. They appeared in offering lists and land transfers and temple redistribution records written with the same bureaucratic precision used for counting sheep. The tablets from Uruk's precinct are small, barely larger than your palm, pressed from river clay that still holds a faint mineral smell of the Euphrates when humidity reaches them. In museum storage, the uneven marks look crude by later standards, wedge-shaped impressions made with cut reeds. Each character is a record of pressure, of intention, of a scribe's hand pushing symbols into soft mud before the sun could bake it permanent. And there. But among the ordinary economics of temple administration, among tallies of grain rations and beer distributions, the Anunnaki are named not as faraway cosmic forces, but as receivers, as owners, as authorities. These holdings require documentation with the same careful detail applied to every other kind of institutional property. This is what makes these earliest references so compelling. There is no origin story attached, no explanation of who these beings are or why they matter to the economic functioning of the city. They are simply built into the system, woven into the administrative machinery of the world's first urban centers. As if every scribe learning the job understood that certain parts of the harvest belonged to the temple, and certain parts of what the temple controlled belonged to beings whose names had to be written with absolute accuracy. This was not worship the way we usually imagine it. This was accounting that treated divine authority as a category that needed the same documentation as herds of livestock and measurements of fields. Perhaps most unsettling, these earliest tablets show no progress, no evolution from simple to complex understanding. The Anunnaki appear fully formed in the written record, with established names, relationships, and hierarchies. As if the scribes were recording something people already understood for generations before anyone thought to press it into clay. As if the knowledge came before writing itself, preserved in oral tradition until cuneiform finally gave it permanent, verifiable form. A permanent form that reads less like mythology and more like witnessing. Like institutional record-keeping, like the documentation of something observed rather than something imagined. The Sumerian king list tells us something major changed. Not slowly, not through cultural evolution, but structurally. The cuneiform is clear about this. Kingship descended from heaven. Before that moment, according to these administrative chronicles, there was no organized government, no cities running under one unified law. Then something shifted, and everything changed. The text, first fully translated by Buckle Jacobson in 1939, opens with a line that has troubled scholars ever since. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu, not established, not founded through human effort. It had descended. A verb that means movement from above to below, from sky to earth, from somewhere else to here. The list that follows records kings who ruled for impossibly long times. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalgar, ruled for 36,000 years. These are not presented as symbolic numbers or mythic time. They are recorded with the same administrative tone used for everything else in Sumerian bureaucracy, as if the scribes who compiled this document believed they were preserving real chronology, not building a legend. Modern scholars offer different explanations. Maybe the numbers represent dynasties instead of individual lifespans. Maybe the calculations use different units instead of solar years. Maybe the entire pre-flood section is pure mythology, designed to give Sumerian civilization an impressively ancient pedigree. But none of these explanations account for what happens next in the text. The king list does not describe a slow shortening of reigns as we move forward through history. It describes a sharp boundary at the flood, impossibly long reigns measured in tens of thousands of years. After the flood, lifespans collapsed toward normal human length within only a few generations. Something fundamental changed, and the Sumerians remembered it clearly enough to build that change into their official royal chronologies, preserving the boundary with the same care they preserved everything else. Archaeological evidence supports this story of sudden transformation, even though it does not explain it. Around 3500 BC, within only a few centuries, southern Mesopotamia went through a revolution. Scattered farming villages gave way to real cities with populations in the tens of thousands. Monumental buildings appeared. Temples were built with advanced knowledge of engineering, astronomy, and geometric proportion. Writing emerged not as simple pictures, but as a working system able to record complex legal transactions and abstract concepts from its earliest examples. Irrigation networks were built that required central planning, mathematical precision, and coordinated labor on a scale that should not have been possible for people who had so recently moved from village life. The technological leap was not a slow accumulation over thousands of years. It was acceleration fast, broad, and recorded in the layers of tell sites across the rock with clear stratigraphy. The Uric period, as archaeologists call it, represents a change so complete that scholars still struggle to explain its speed. One moment scattered farming communities, the next an urban civilization operating at a level of complexity that would not be matched again for over 1,000 years. And in the tablets pressed during this revolutionary period, the Anunnaki are already established, already functioning as institutional authorities whose existence required no justification, no introduction, no explanation, only documentation. But here is what the tablets also show. This did not last forever. Somewhere between the early Sumerian period and the later Babylonian era, something shifted again. Not in the cities themselves, which continued to grow. Not in the temples, which remained centers of economic and ritual life, but in how divine authority was recorded, whether divine authority was recorded as active or remembered as ancestral. The change is subtle enough that you could miss it if you were not reading carefully, but it is there, preserved in the progression of text across centuries. The Anunnaki do not disappear dramatically. They do not die in cosmic battles or fade through neglect. They simply stop intervening in human affairs. And the records note this absence with the same precision they once used to document their presence. To understand what ended, we first need to understand what existed. And the earliest tablets make one thing unmistakably clear. The Anunnaki were not treated as abstract religious ideas. They were built into the institutional machinery of Sumerian civilization with administrative detail that myths do not need. The inner precinct in Uruk, the temple complex dedicated to the goddess Inanna, produced thousands of tablets between 3300 and 3000 BC. These are not religious hymns or creation epics. They are economic documents. Receipts for barley deliveries, ration lists for temple workers, land transfer agreements, labor assignments for canal maintenance. And throughout these ordinary records, divine names appear not as prayers or blessings, but as accounting categories. A tablet from around 3100 BC records the transfer of a field near the city wall. The text specifies the field's dimensions, its irrigation access, and its ownership. Field of Enlil, southern parcel, assigned to the temple administrator for barley production. Enlil does not receive metaphorical tribute. He owns real land, measured in real units, managed by real human workers who report harvest yields with the same accountability used for any institutional landowner. Another tablet lists sheep distributed from temple holdings. 63 ewes, property of, and 41 rams, property of Enki, delivered to the shepherd Lugulimish for seasonal pasture. The gods hold livestock portfolios. The animals carry their marks. The shepherds are responsible to divine owners for the herd's increase or loss, documented in follow tablets that track births, deaths, and wool production with meticulous precision. This is what separates these records from mythology. Myths exaggerate. They amplify. They turn ordinary events into cosmic drama, mortal kings into demigods, historical conflicts into battles between primordial forces. But these tablets do the opposite. They reduce divine ownership to the same bureaucratic language used for human transactions. They apply accounting standards to the holdings of beings who supposedly created the cosmic order. Why bother with such precision if the gods were only symbolic? The temple redistribution economy offers one answer, though it raises more questions than it solves. temples in early Mesopotamia worked as the main economic institutions of their cities. They collected offerings, managed farming production, employed craftsmen, and redistributed goods to workers and dependents. The entire system required detailed record-keeping to function, and that record-keeping consistently labeled certain holdings as divine property. Fields, marked as belonging to an annual, produced grain that went into separate accounting streams from fields owned by the temple institution itself or by private individuals. The difference mattered enough that scribes kept parallel records, tracking divine holdings with the same rigor they used for everything else. Temple administrators could be held accountable for mismanaging human property. The tablet suggests they could also be held accountable for mismanaging divine property, as if someone, somewhere, might actually audit the difference. Even more revealing are references to the divine decrees or authorities that could be transferred, granted, or withdrawn. And later myths, like the story of Inanna and Enki, described the as cosmic powers. The ability to make judgments, authority over warfare, knowledge of metalworking. But in the administrative tablets, the appears transferable. Institutional authorities. A temple receives the of justice, meaning it gains jurisdiction over legal disputes. A city receives the of kingship, granting it political supremacy over neighboring settlements. These are not metaphors. They are documented transfers of real governance functions, recorded with start dates and authorized signatures, preserved because they had legal force. A tablet from the Ina precinct records. The of grain storage transferred from the house of Enlil to the house of Inanna by decree, witnessed by the temple administrator and the city council. This reads like a jurisdiction agreement between government departments, not a mythological story. Authority moves from one divine institution to another through bureaucratic process, and the change requires documentation precisely because it affects how real resources are controlled. Critics might argue this only shows how ancient people thought about their world, that they projected institutional structures onto the gods because they could not imagine power working any other way. But that explanation struggles against the consistency and seriousness of the records. These scribes were not primitive thinkers who could not handle abstraction. They were highly trained specialists running the most advanced administrative system human civilization had yet developed. And they could tell the difference between symbolic, ritual, and practical management. Their archives prove it in thousands of tablets that separate ceremonial offerings from economic transactions. Yet, when recording divine ownership, they chose the language of practical management. They applied property law to the holdings of an. They tracked annuals, grain stores with the same attention to surplus and deficit used for human accounts. They treated them as transferable authorities, subject to bureaucratic procedure, rather than eternal cosmic principles. The tablets do not explain why this precision mattered. They simply kept it, generation after generation, as if the difference between divine property and human property had consequences that required careful documentation. As if someone, somewhere, noticed the difference. Why record divine property with the same precision as grain, unless that property was as real as the grain, as open to audit, as liable to be called to account. The Sumerian king list does not read like mythology. It reads like a chronological register, the kind of document bureaucracies produce when they need to prove legal succession and continuity. Yet, inside its administrative format is a boundary so sharp, so carefully preserved across multiple copies over centuries, that it demands explanation. The text opens with a phrase that appears in nearly every surviving version. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was an Eridu. Not founded, not established through human achievement. It had descended, as if political authority itself came from somewhere else and settled first in the southernmost city of Sumer. What follows is a list of antediluvian kings rulers. The reign before the Great Flood that appears in Mesopotamian tradition is a historical dividing line. 5 cities held kingship in order during this primordial era: Eridu, Battabir, Larak, Sippar, and Shurapak. 8 kings ruled across these cities, and the reign lengths are preserved with numerical precision that should suggest but does not. Alulim, first king of Eridu, ruled for 28,800 years. Ulalgar, his successor, ruled for 36,000 years. In Meluan of Battabir held kingship for 43,200 years. The numbers continue in this way through all 8 pre-flood rulers. Each reign measured in tens of thousands of years, each figure recorded as carefully as later historical reigns measured in decades. Then the text says simply the flood swept over, and everything changes. Post-flood kingship begins in Kish. The first king after the deluge reigns for 1,200 years. Still impossibly long by modern standards, but only a fraction of the antediluvian spans. His successor rules for 960 years. Within several generations, reign lengths drop to 600 years, then 400, then numbers that begin approaching what Human lifespans might reach under exceptional circumstances. By the time the king list reaches the 3rd dynasty of around 2100 BC, the reigns are completely normal. Kings rule for 7 years, 15 years, 23 years. Normal human spans recorded with the same administrative precision used for the earlier impossible spans. Scholars have proposed different interpretations for the antediluvian numbers. Maybe they represent symbolic time, with years standing for something else, months, seasons, or ritual cycles. Maybe each king is really a dynasty, with the total years showing the combined rule of multiple generations compressed into one name. Maybe the whole pre-flood section is ritual exaggeration meant to give Sumerian civilization a properly ancient pedigree reaching back to the moment when the gods themselves established earthly rule. But these explanations struggle against what the text actually preserves. If the numbers were symbolic, why do they collapse so suddenly after the flood instead of slowly? If they represented dynasties, why does the format stay the same before and after the boundary, with no sign that the counting method changed? If this were ritual exaggeration, why keep such specific figures? Why not rounded numbers or cosmic multiples? That would clearly signal metaphor. The king list exists in multiple copies, made in different cities and in different periods. The Well-Blundell prism, the most complete version, dates to around 1800 BC. Other fragments come from Nippur and Larsa, across several centuries of copying and recopying. Yet across all these versions, the pattern stays consistent. The antediluvian section preserves impossibly long reigns. The flood makes a sharp boundary, and post-flood reigns shrink toward human scale in only a few generations. Scribes copying this text centuries apart, working in different cities under different dynasties, kept the same numerical pattern with the same administrative tone. They were not embellishing or turning it into myth. They were preserving what they believed was a historical record, one that documented a fundamental change in how authority worked. Thorkild Jacobson, who produced the first complete English translation in 1939, noted the list's strange character. It works as a political document, establishing which cities held legitimate authority and in what order. Yet, it reaches back into time that should not be available to historical memory, documenting an era when kingship itself was new. Something that descended from heaven instead of growing out of human social development. The administrative format continues the whole way through. Each king is named, each city identified, each reign length stated. There are no stories, no descriptions of achievements or failures. Just names, places, and numbers, the skeleton of chronology, without the flesh of story. But that skeleton preserves something the scribes thought was worth protecting across generations of copying: the boundary itself, the moment when one kind of time ended and another began. The shift from an age measured in spans no human could witness to an age measured in lifetimes that slowly became recognizably human. Later, Mesopotamian chronicles do not treat the king list as mythology. They refer to it, build on it, and use it to establish historical continuity. The Babylonian chronicle, the Assyrian king lists. These later documents assume the Sumerian king list describes real chronology, however strange its earliest sections might seem. Why preserve a boundary so carefully if it never mattered? Why keep impossible reign lengths with the same precision used for historical kings? If the difference between eras was only symbolic, the text gives no explanation. It simply records the boundary and moves forward, documenting the long, slow shrinking of time from the divine scale to the human scale, across generations of kings whose reigns grew shorter with each succession, as if something was wearing off, something was fading, something that once made longer spans possible no longer applied. The Atrahasis epic does not present the flood as divine punishment for human evil. It presents it as an administrative failure, crisis in governance caused by conflicting policies among the gods themselves. And it ends not in triumph, but in regret, restraint, and a major restructuring of how divine authority would relate to human populations going forward. The epic, preserved in old Babylonian tablets from around 1700 BC, but pointing to older traditions, begins not with humanity's moral failures, but with a labor dispute. The lesser gods, the Igigi, rebel against their workload. They have been digging irrigation canals, maintaining the rivers, doing the physical labor required to keep cosmic order. They refuse to continue. The great gods Anu, Enlil, Enki face a crisis in governance. The world's infrastructure needs maintenance, but the workers have rebelled. Enki proposes a solution: create humans to carry the labor burden. Humanity is designed, formed from clay and divine blood, specifically to do the work the lesser gods refuse. This is not a creation story about divine love or cosmic purpose. It is an institutional solution to a management problem. The plan works. Humanity multiplies, takes over the labor, maintains the irrigation systems and temples. But then, a new problem appears. The text is clear: humanity becomes too numerous, too noisy. The sound of human cities disturbs Enlil's sleep. He cannot rest. The problem is described not as moral corruption, but as population density, too many people making too much noise, disrupting the cosmic order through sheer volume. Enlil decides to reduce the human population. He sends plague. Humanity suffers, but Enki, who created humans and seems to have developed something like fondness for his creation, intervenes. He teaches humanity how to appease the plague god, how to make the right offerings. The plague ends. Enlil tries again. Drought. Enki again intervenes, showing humans how to reach underground water. The drought fails to reduce the population enough. Enlil proposes the flood not as punishment, but as a reset, a total solution to the problem by eliminating the population completely. The Divine Council debates. This is crucial. The gods do not agree. Enlil pushes for total destruction. Enki opposes it, but he is bound by oath not to warn humanity directly. So Enki finds a workaround. He speaks to a reed wall while Atrahasis, a human king, happens to be on the other side. He tells the wall, not the man, to build a boat, to seal it with bitumen, to save pairs of animals. The instructions are precise dimensions, materials, construction methods. This is not dreamlike imagery. It reads like engineering specifications delivered through a bureaucratic loophole. The flood comes. Humanity is destroyed except for those in the boat. And then the text turns to something unexpected. The gods are not celebrating. They are horrified. They realize they have lost their workforce. The sacrifices stop. No one maintains the temples. No one brings offerings. The gods, the epic says clearly, gather around sacrifices like flies when Atrahasis finally makes landfall and performs the first post-flood ritual. They are hungry. They need humanity. Enlil is furious that anyone survived. But the other gods overrule him. Humanity will continue, but not the way it did before. New limits must be set. The gods swear oaths, binding agreements the text treats as legally enforceable. They will not destroy humanity again, but humanity will no longer reproduce without limits. The epic lists the new controls set by divine decree. Some women will be infertile, some children will die young, priestesses will be forbidden from having children, demons will take infants, and human lifespan itself will be limited. No more of the multi-century spans that earlier humans enjoyed. These are not curses in the usual myth sense. They are population control. Policies, administrative rules meant to keep human numbers at sustainable levels, without another catastrophic reset. The tone is administrative, as if the gods are learning from their failure, putting new procedures in place to prevent future crisis. But here is what the epic also preserves after the flood: divine intervention decreases. The gods establish their new policies, then largely step back from direct management. They do not rule more tightly. After their failure, they rule less directly. They set parameters. Mortality, limited fertility, disease, then let the system run within those constraints. Later Mesopotamian tradition treats the flood as the boundary between ages, the moment when the relationship between gods and humans changed fundamentally. Before the flood, according to these traditions, humans lived longer and the gods intervened more directly. The line between divine and human authority was less clearly drawn. After the flood, everything runs at greater distance. The gods remain present in ritual and temple economy, but they are no longer managing daily operations. They have set structural limits instead of needing constant oversight. This pattern appears not only in Atrahasis, but across Mesopotamian flood traditions. The gods make a decision that turns catastrophic. They realize their mistake. They swear oaths limiting what they will do in the future. They make systemic changes that reduce the need for direct intervention. Then they step back. Why did the gods step back after the flood instead of ruling more tightly? The text suggests something disturbing. They learned that direct management leads to crisis, that too much intervention destabilizes the system, that the solution to governance failure is not more control, but less boundaries instead of supervision, limits instead of oversight, distance instead of presence. The flood was not divine judgment. Humanity survived. It was divine policy the gods themselves regretted and never fully repeated. The earliest law codes do not only use divine authority as a fancy introduction. They describe gods as active participants in legal process, present authorities who guarantee enforcement and require consultation. Later codes name the same gods, but only once at the beginning, as distant givers of authority who then disappear completely from the working mechanics of justice. The shift is subtle but systematic, preserved across centuries of legal development with enough consistency to suggest something more than just changing writing style. The Code of Vernamu, dating to about 2100 BC, opens with the king saying that he was chosen by the gods and Enlil to establish justice in the land. But the prologue goes further. It describes the gods as active overseers who set equity in the land through the king's hand. The legal judgments that follow are not presented as purely human decisions supported by divine approval. They are presented as implementations of divine will, with the gods as the ultimate judicial authority, and the king as the executive agent. The language keeps this partnership clear. The gods decreed, and an Enlil commanded. The king carries out judgments, but the source of legal authority remains explicitly divine in present tense. The gods are not invoked as ancient founders of law. They are described as current authorities whose will the legal system keeps carrying out. About a century later, the Code of Lipodishter keeps a similar structure. The king receives his mandate from Enlil. The gods command that justice be established, but something starts to change in the language. The divine role is still stressed in the prologue, but the actual legal provisions, the specific judgments about property, marriage, slavery, inheritance, no longer mention divine involvement in enforcing them. The gods grant authority. Then the text moves into purely human systems of judgment and penalty. By the time Hammurabi's code is carved around 1750 BC, the pattern has hardened. The prologue is long, listing Hammurabi's divine endorsements from many gods across many cities. Anu and Enlil appoint him. Marduk grants him kingship. Shamash, the god of justice, gives him the authority to establish law. The language is rich, and the divine authorization is complete and explicit. Then the gods disappear from the working text. 282 legal provisions follow, covering everything from murder to property, damage to professional liability. And not once do the gods appear as enforcers, judges, or guarantors of specific rulings. The punishments are carried out by human officials. The evidence is weighed by human judges. The appeals process involves human authorities. Divine presence is completely missing from the mechanics of justice. The epilogue returns to divine language, warning that future kings who change the laws will face divine punishment. But this also shows a shift. Here, the gods are not actively running the current system. They are positioned as future punishers of possible violations, passive guardians of legal continuity, instead of active participants in daily justice. Shamash, who appears in the famous stele showing Hammurabi receiving the laws, serves as a symbolic guarantor. The image shows the god seated, extending symbols of authority to the king who stands before him. It is a moment of transfer, a moment of delegation. Authority moving from a divine source to a human administrator. And after that transfer, the god stays in the image but not in the text. The grant has been made. The system runs on its own. This progression from active divine participation to symbolic authorization repeats across multiple legal traditions in Mesopotamia. Earlier texts described gods as present authorities. Later texts describe gods as founding authorities who set the system up, but no longer run it day by day. The language consistently suggests a handover rather than abandonment, delegation rather than withdrawal, but delegation that becomes so complete that divine involvement stops being needed for the system to work. Legal documents from the Old Babylonian period show this in practice. Contracts name gods as witnesses, but enforcement is entirely human. Court records refer to divine justice in general terms, but record purely human court procedures. Temple archives hold thousands of legal texts, land sales, loans, marriage agreements, adoption contracts, and while these documents often begin with divine indications, they end with human signatures, human seals, and human guarantees of enforcement. The gods authorize the system, then disappear from its operation. Kings rule in their name, but without their presence. Judges invoke their authority, but issue verdicts alone. The whole legal system keeps working as if divine participation became unnecessary after the foundational grant of authority was given. This is not a simple, straight line into secular thinking. The gods remain central to ritual, temple economy, and the theological meaning of kingship. But in the practical administration of justice, they shift from participants to predecessors, from active overseers to distant founders whose initial authorization still legitimizes a system that no longer needs them involved to operate. The pattern appears across areas in temple administration, in political government, and legal procedure. Authority that once required continuous divine presence begins working through human agents alone. Not because the gods are forgotten, but because the delegation becomes complete. The system runs on precedent, on institutional structure, on human enforcement of principles the gods set up but no longer need to enforce directly. Why do gods stop enforcing what they once governed? The texts never explain the transition. They simply record it, preserving in law codes across centuries the steady withdrawal of divine presence from the working mechanisms of power while keeping divine authorization as the source of legitimacy that supports the whole structure. Authority granted once apparently needs no renewal, only memory. Gilgamesh is described with a precision that myths usually do not. Need 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, not half, not descended from gods in the vague way many ancient rulers claimed divine ancestry, but 2/3 The fraction is specific, deliberate, repeated across versions of the epic, as if the ratio mattered for understanding what he was. The old Babylonian version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, dating to around 1800 BC but preserving older Sumerian traditions, opens with this formula. Gilgamesh's parentage is given. His father, Lugalbanda, was a king of Uruk, a mortal man later deified. His mother, Ninsun, was a goddess described in temple hymns as the wild cow with wisdom and strength beyond human capacity. This union produced Gilgamesh, and the text is clear about what this mixture is: 2/3 divine, 1/3 mortal. The math is strange, enough to demand attention. Most myths about Divinahuman children speak of half-blood demigods who inherit partial divine nature. Greek heroes like Heracles, Akkadian figures like These are usually described as half-divine at most, the simple result of one divine and one human parent. But Gilgamesh's fraction does not work like that. 2/3 divine heritage suggests something more complex than simple parentage, either bloodline where divine ancestry became concentrated across generations, or a formula ancient scribes considered important enough to keep through centuries of copying and translation. The epic describes what this ratio produced in physical terms. Gilgamesh is taller than ordinary men, stronger, able to do feats no fully human warrior could do. He does not tire the way others do. He needs less sleep. His endurance in battle and travel exceeds normal human ability by margins. The text treats as observable, not magical. When he and Enkidu travel to the cedar forest, the distances they cover in days would take ordinary men weeks. The text presents this as natural for Gilgamesh, a result of his mix nature, yet he is mortal. This becomes the central tragedy of the epic. Despite his divine heritage, despite his physical superiority, despite his mother being a goddess who hears his prayers and helps him, Gilgamesh will die. The death of his companion, Enkidu, forces him to face this reality. And the whole second half of the epic follows his desperate attempt to escape death. An attempt that fails. He seeks out Utnapishtim, the flood's survivor, who was given immortality by the gods. He finds him. He hears the story of how divine favor can grant eternal life. But when given the chance to prove himself worthy of the same gift, Gilgamesh fails. He cannot stay awake for 7 days. He cannot overcome the basic limits of his mortal third. The gods gave immortality to Utnapishtim under special conditions. After the flood conditions they swore they would never repeat. For Gilgamesh, no exception will be made. He returns to Uruk empty-handed, accepting mortality. His great strength and divine heritage unable to break the basic limit built into his nature. The epic ends not with his death, but with his acceptance of it, his turn toward building a legacy through works that will outlast him. The walls of Uruk, the temples he founded, the civilization he strengthened. These will remain. He will not. Historical records place Gilgamesh's reign around 2700 BC, making him a contemporary of Egypt's early dynastic period. The Sumerian king list includes him, giving him a normal reign length of 126 years long by human standards, but nothing like the antediluvian spans, and possibly a compressed dynastic total rather than one lifespan. Whether Gilgamesh was a historical king or a legendary figure is still debated, but what is clear is that Mesopotamian tradition treated him as the last of his kind. After Gilgamesh, no later ruler claims the 2/3 divine formula. Kings keep claiming divine favor, divine selection, even divine parentage in a loose sense. But the specific fractional heritage, the measurable mixture of divine and human blood that produce observable physical differences, does not appear again in the records. The Sumerian king list, which records kings both before and after Gilgamesh, shows no successors with similar claims. The dynasties that follow are completely human. Their reigns are measured in human spans. Their authority comes from divine approval, but not from divine blood. The era of hybrid rulers ends with Gilgamesh's death, and Mesopotamian kingship becomes purely human administration under divine mandate. Skeptics might reasonably argue that the 2/3 formula is symbolic numerology, and that the whole idea of Divinahuman hybrids is myth rather than biology. Hero myths across cultures include figures of mixed divine and human heritage, and the pattern is not unique to Mesopotamia. Treating Gilgamesh's fraction as literal documentation of bloodline ratios means accepting ideas about Divinahuman reproduction that strain credibility. But two details complicate that dismissal. First, the rarity of the specific fraction. If it were purely symbolic, why not use the more common half-divine label? Why keep a mathematically unusual ratio across multiple versions of the text? Second, the finality of his position. Gilgamesh is not presented as one example among many Divinahuman hybrids. He is presented as the last. And the tradition keeps this boundary. After him, the bloodline ends. The era closes. His funeral, described in fragmentary Sumerian poems, involved elaborate rituals and offerings to underworld gods. His tomb was reportedly built in the Euphrates riverbed built while the water was diverted, then sealed as the river was released to flow over it, so it could never be disturbed, never dug up, never proven or disproven. Archaeological searches in the 1920s and again in the early 2000s found possible sites matching the descriptions, but nothing conclusive. The riverbed keeps its secrets. What remains are texts describing a figure with unusual precision, measurable divine heritage, superior physical ability, and final mortality, a figure after whom such fractional claims disappear from kingship. A boundary marker between an age when divine blood could visibly show in human rulers and an age when kingship became a purely human office authorized by distant gods. Why does the divine human line stop instead of continuing? The texts offer no explanation. They only record that it did, that Gilgamesh was the last, that his specific mixture of divine and mortal heritage produced no successors, and that after his reign, the nature of kingship changed permanently, becoming administration rather than hybrid authority. The bloodline ends. The formula disappears from the records, and Mesopotamian civilization continues without rulers, but can claim to be two-thirds anything other than human. At the top of the Mesopotamian divine hierarchy sits Anu, the sky god, the highest authority over all the Anunnaki. Yet across thousands of tablets over thousands of years, Anu barely shows up. He issues no regular decrees. He intervenes in no daily affairs. He settles no disputes that the records preserve. His authority is absolute and unquestioned, but his presence is so rare that his absence becomes more defining than any action credited to him. This is not the silence of a forgotten god. This is the silence of an authority so supreme that direct involvement has become unnecessary or maybe impossible. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic preserved in 7th century BC. Tablets pointing to older traditions, places Anu at the foundation of cosmic order. When the primordial gods Asu and Tiamat threaten to destroy the younger gods, Anu confronts them first, but he cannot defeat them alone. He retreats. He takes over the immediate crisis, killing Asu. Later, when Tiamat seeks revenge, the gods gather in council and offer kingship to whoever can defeat her. Marduk accepts, wins, and receives supreme authority over the cosmos. But Anu does not vanish from the hierarchy. He remains the ultimate sovereign, the source from which all other authorities receive legitimacy. Marduk rules, but he rules under Anu's mandate. The divine council meets in Anu's court. The cosmic order runs according to principles Anu established. Yet Anu himself stops acting directly once the system is set. The pattern repeats across Mesopotamian theology. Anu is invoked in the most solemn oaths, his name carrying more binding weight than any other god. Kings claim to rule by his highest authority. Temple hierarchies place his cult at the top of religious scriptures. But myths, prayers, and administrative texts do not show Anu intervening the way other gods do. Enlil manages the earth. Enki provides wisdom and solves problems. Shamash oversees justice. Ishtar involves herself in war and love. Each has domains, roles, recorded actions. Anu has supreme authority and almost total absence. His temple in Uruk-the-Ina was one of the most important religious centers in Mesopotamia. Thousands of administrative tablets from this temple complex survive, documenting offerings, property management, and ritual schedules. Anu receives offerings. His temple holds huge estates. His cult employs hundreds of workers. The whole institutional system runs in his name. But there are no oracles credited to him, no direct communications, no recorded moments of Anu speaking to priests or kings the way other gods were said to do. The divine council structure explains part of this. Ancient Near Eastern government worked through layered delegation. Earthly kings appointed administrators, governors, judges, people who acted with royal mandate without needing constant royal supervision. The system worked because power could be delegated downward while ultimate sovereignty stayed at the top. The Mesopotamian divine hierarchy mirrors this. Anu sits as the ultimate sovereign, but governance is delegated to the council of great gods, who then delegate specific jobs to lesser gods, who oversee different parts of cosmic and earthly order. The chain of authority runs from Anu downward through many levels, each level acting with the authority of the one above, without needing direct intervention from that higher level. This lets the system run efficiently. Anu does not need to settle every dispute or oversee every ritual because the authority structure he set can operate without his constant presence. His absence does not cause chaos because he built a hierarchy able to manage itself. But this raises a deeper question. The other gods Enlil, Enki, Marduk, Ishtar also largely step back from direct intervention as Mesopotamian history moves on. We have traced this pullback through law codes, administrative tablets, the shift from divine presence to divine memory. Yet the system continues, temples function, rituals proceed. Cities operate, kingship persists. The whole social, political, and religious or it keeps running as if divine presence, while still seen as foundational, has become practically unnecessary. Anu's absence sits at the top of this larger pattern. If the highest authority could always function without direct presence, if the top of the hierarchy never needed visibility to keep order, then maybe the withdrawal of other divine authorities follows the same rule. Maybe the Anunnaki did not leave because they stopped mattering. Maybe they left because the system they built became stable enough to last without them. Or maybe Anu's absence points to something more unsettling: authority that exists beyond observable action, power that works through structure instead of intervention, sovereignty that holds itself through hierarchies designed to run without direct oversight. Later, theological texts describe Anu as living in the highest heaven, distant even from the other gods. He does not come down. He does not walk among humans, or even among the divine council, except in extraordinary situations. His remoteness is treated not as neglect, but as proper for his status. The highest authority is, by nature, distant. This creates a model where divinity increases with distance, where the greatest powers are the least visible, where ultimate sovereignty shows itself through absence rather than presence. It is a theology of delegation taken to its furthest point. The cosmos running on established principles rather than constant intervention, on structural authority rather than personal action, on systems that last because they were built to last, not because they need active maintenance. The administrative tablets support this model. Temple economies ran for centuries with remarkable consistency. Ritual calendars kept precise cycles across generations. Legal systems worked according to established codes. The institutional machinery of Mesopotamian civilization showed unusual stability for thousands of years, adapting to political changes and cultural shifts while keeping core structures that required no divine intervention to continue. Anu's authority guaranteed the system, and his absence showed the system's maturity. But there is another possible reading, one the texts neither confirm nor deny. Maybe Anu's absence is not chosen distance, but forced distance. Maybe the highest authority stopped being able to intervene, and the system continued not because it was designed for independence, but because it had no choice. Maybe the hierarchy that allowed delegation became a structure that trapped higher powers in their own distance, unable to come down even if circumstances demanded it. The texts do not give an answer. They only record what can be seen. A system built on divine authority that keeps working while the highest divinity stays permanently absent, present only in name and principle, never in action. The cosmos running on momentum, on institutional inertia, on structures established so completely that they no longer need the founders to maintain them. Can a system last after its rulers withdraw? Mesopotamian civilization suggests it can. Thousands of years of remarkable stability across empires, dynasties, and cultural change. The machinery keeps running. The order persists. Authority without presence becomes a basic rule for how the world works. And at the top of this absent authority, Anu remains in position, but never in presence supreme. And silent, the ultimate source of cosmic order, who long ago stopped being an active participant in the order he founded. By the Neo-Assyrian period, roughly 900 to 600 BC, something major has changed in how divine authority is recorded. The gods remain central to religious life, to royal ideology, to the entire worldview of Mesopotamian civilization. But they no longer act. They no longer intervene. They no longer appear in stories as agents making decisions that directly affect human affairs. The silence is not sudden. It is slow enough that you could miss it if you were not reading carefully across centuries. But it is there, preserved in the growth of royal inscriptions, temple records, and ritual texts. The Anunnaki shift from active authorities to ancestral memories, from participants in rule to symbolic guarantors of an order that runs entirely without them. Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions give some of the clearest evidence. Kings like Ashurnasirpal II, Shalmaneser III, and Sargon II wrote long annals recording their military campaigns, building projects, and administrative achievements. These texts name the gods constantly. Every victory is credited to divine favor. Every building project is done at divine command. The gods bless, approve, and authorize everything the king does. But the gods never speak. They never appear. They never deliver oracles the way earlier texts describe. The kings credit their success to divine will, but the mechanism is entirely indirect. The gods' approval is guessed from results, not heard in prophecies or seen in visions. When Ashurnasirpal II conquers a city, he credits Ashur and the great gods for his victory. But the credit is after the fact. A religious reading of military success, not a claim that a god stepped in during the battle. Compare this to earlier Mesopotamian royal inscriptions. When Sargon of Akkad conquered Sumer around 2300 BC, texts describe the gods transferring authority to him, appearing to him, guiding his choices. When Hammurabi defeated his enemies in 1750, BC, his inscriptions describe Marduk calling him to kingship, speaking through temple oracles, directing his campaigns. The language suggests divine agency, God's choosing, communicating, intervening in events. By the Neo-Assyrian period, this direct agency has disappeared from the inscriptions. The gods become passive sources of legitimacy, rather than active participants. They establish the cosmic order in which the king works, but they do not direct specific actions. They withdraw to the level of structural authority present in principle, absent in practice. Temple archives from this period show the same pattern. Thousands of administrative texts survive from major temples in Assyria and Babylonia. There are court offerings, property transactions, priestly appointments, ritual schedules, all the machinery of institutional religion at scale. The gods are named constantly. They receive offerings. Their festivals are kept with precision. Their temples employ hundreds of workers and control huge farming estates. But nowhere in these administrative texts do the gods act. They do not give instructions. They do not answer questions. They do not intervene in temple management. The whole system runs as if the gods are theoretical owners who never actually take part in administration. The system runs on autopilot, maintained by human workers who invoke divine authority but never claim divine guidance. Ritual texts from the period are just as revealing. Detailed instructions survive for countless ceremonies, daily offerings, seasonal festivals, coronations, military rites. The precision is extraordinary, every movement stated, every prayer written, every offering measured and timed. These are complex performances meant to honor the gods, maintain cosmic order, and ensure divine favor. But the rituals no longer expect an answer. Earlier Mesopotamian religion included divination, where priests tried to receive divine communication. In many ways, reading animal organs, interpreting dreams, observing the sky. These practices continue in the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods, but they change in character. Divination becomes more technical, focused on reading fixed signs instead of getting spontaneous divine messages. Omen texts grow during this year. Huge collections listing sky events and their predicted results. Liver patterns and their meanings, dream symbols and their interpretations. These texts work like manuals, letting priests decode divine will by checking standardized charts instead of receiving direct communication. The gods supposedly place messages in natural events, but the messages follow fixed patterns that humans can't learn to read mechanically. This marks a major change from living oracles to technical interpretation. The gods no longer speak directly. They set up a system of signs that runs by consistent principles, and humans become skilled at reading those signs without needing the gods to actively communicate. Theology becomes method. Divine speech becomes natural law. Astrology becomes a leading form of divination in this year. The stars and planets move in observable patterns. Those patterns can be matched to events on Earth. Over generations, Mesopotamian scholars built huge databases of sky observations and related historical outcomes. They made mathematical models to predict planetary positions. They built a complex system for reading cosmic signs. But the system works because the gods apparently programmed cosmic order to run on its own. The planets move by fixed rules. The correlations follow consistent patterns. The priest does not need the gods to intervene or explain. They only need to observe, record, calculate, and interpret using established methods. The world runs without direct divine participation, and it runs well. The Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods saw Mesopotamia reach peaks of political power, economic wealth, and cultural achievements. Cities grew. Empires expanded. Art and literature thrived. The machinery of civilization ran with extraordinary efficiency. Temples, palaces, legal systems, military organizations, farming infrastructure, trade networks, all working as if the gods who founded the system finished their work and stepped back, leaving behind structures able to keep going on their own. The silence is not a crisis. It is stability. It is a cosmos that has matured beyond the need for active divine management, running on principles so deeply embedded that they become self-sustaining. Later, Babylonian theological texts reflect on this. They describe the gods as having set order, creation, set everything in motion through divine wisdom, and handed maintenance to human administrators working under divine mandate. The gods remain sovereign, but sovereigns who no longer need to govern directly because the systems they created run independently. This could be read as theological growth, a mature view that divinity works through natural law instead of random intervention. Or it could be read as secularization hidden inside religious language, human institutions claiming divine legitimacy while working entirely through human action. Or it could be read as historical documentation of a real withdrawal, a transition where beings who once actively took part in governing civilization stepped back into ritual memory, leaving behind only the structures they built and the signs they placed in cosmic order. The texts do not say What trading is right. They only record what remains. Visible, a world that continues without direct divine presence, a civilization that works through human management of principles credited to gods who no longer visibly take part in the order they supposedly founded. The silence is stable. The absence is sustainable. The system persists what ends without collapse. The Anunnaki era apparently did. It shifts not through catastrophe, but through slow normalization, not through destruction, but through delegation completed, not through the gods leaving, but through the world learning to run without them while still keeping this story. That they remain in authority. There is no final battle, no cosmic war, ending with the Anunnaki defeated or destroyed. No disaster that explains their departure. No dramatic ending preserved in myth or chronicle. The divine era does not end. It simply stops being recorded as present and starts being remembered as past. Across 3,000 years of written records, the pattern repeats with unsettling consistency. The Anunnaki begin as institutional realities, named authorities and administrative texts, owners of property, guarantors of law, active participants in governance. They shift into symbolic legitimizers, distant sources of royal mandate. Founders of cosmic order, guarantors who no longer enforce what they guarantee. Finally, they become ancestral memories honored in ritual, named in prayer, but never expected to intervene, never recorded as acting, never present, except in the strictures they supposedly left behind. The change happens slowly enough that no single generation would have seen it as a crisis. Each generation inherited a system a little more human-run than the one before, a little less dependent on direct divine intervention, a little more able to keep going through institutional momentum instead of active divine participation. The silence piled up slowly like sediment until the gap between early texts and late texts revealed something that would have been invisible to people living through the transition. The king list recorded a boundary. The flood stories preserved memory of a policy change. Law codes showed authority being delegated. Gilgamesh marked the end of hybrid bloodlines. Anu's absence modeled sovereignty without presence. Later inscriptions showed stable order without divine action. Each piece of evidence alone could be explained away. Together they form a pattern that explains nothing, but records everything: a steady withdrawal of divine presence from the working machinery of civilization, leaving behind only memory, ritual, and structures built to last without their founders. Maybe the Anunnaki finished their work and left, satisfied that human civilization could continue without supervision. Maybe they were called away by events the texts do not record. Maybe they never existed the way the records suggest, and what we are tracing is the evolution of religious thought from simple to sophisticated. Or maybe something else, something the scribes noticed but could not explain, something that changed the basic relationship between divine authority and human government, something that made direct intervention impossible, or unnecessary, or forbidden. The tablets do not say. They simply move forward, recording the world as it continued without the active presence of beings that once required the same bureaucratic precision as grain inventories. History does not always end loudly. Sometimes there are no explanations, no final decrees, and no dramatic moment you can point to and say, there, that is when everything changed. Sometimes authority simply pulls back slowly enough that each generation adapts without crisis, until one day you are reading tablets from different eras and realizing the gods stopped appearing as actors in their own story. The silence became normal. The system learned to run without them. Memory replaced presence, and Mesopotamian civilization continued for thousands of years, built on foundations credited to beings who had long since stopped taking part in what they founded. What kind of authority leaves no explanation and is never replaced? The question remains pressed in clay, unanswered. Across 3,000 years of human record-keeping, maybe that is the point. Or maybe the silence itself is the only answer the Anunnaki left behind.